At just 32 years old, he ruled most of the known world. Then, without warning, everything began to fall apart.
In 334 BC, the 20-year-old king of Macedonia led his army across the Hellespont and into the heart of the Persian Empire. Over the next decade, Alexander secured a level of military dominance that the world had never seen before. At the river Granicus and Issus, he crushed massive Persian forces. He led from the front, charging directly at King Darius III, and twice forcing the King of Kings to flee the field in panic. Before he reached 30, Alexander had seized the royal treasuries of Persia, conquered territories stretching to the borders of India, and been crowned pharaoh of Egypt. This expansion relied on the absolute loyalty of his Macedonian veterans. They were bound to him by years of shared sacrifice and a belief that under his command they could not be defeated. With the Persian military shattered and his own borders stretching to the edge of the known world, Alexander stood alone at the top. No external enemy remained that could challenge his rule. But at this moment of absolute invincibility, a devastating, invisible threat began to emerge from within the king's own mind. He began a systematic campaign of suspicion against his closest friends, his most senior generals, and the veteran soldiers who had bled to build his empire. This internal cycle of violence escalated for years, eventually leading to a sudden, highly suspicious death at the age of just 32. The borders of his empire were still expanding, but the man at its center was beginning to unravel. Following the fall of Persepolis and the death of Darius, Alexander found himself the undisputed ruler of the East. To secure his new throne, he began to adopt the customs, the dress, and the rigid court rituals of the very Persians he had just defeated. To his Macedonian veterans, this was a betrayal. They had fought for a Greek king who stood among them, not a monarch who hid behind silk robes and elaborate foreign ceremonies. By attempting to fuse these two worlds, Alexander drove a wedge between himself and his core supporters. This cultural shift bred a deep mutual distrust. Loyal veterans were no longer seen as brothers in arms, but as political obstacles to Alexander's new vision of kingship. In the remote eastern provinces, that distrust turned lethal. When Alexander was warned of an assassination plot, he chose to strike first and strike hard. Philotas, the respected commander of the elite cavalry, was tortured and executed on charges of conspiracy. But Alexander didn't stop there. Fearing a reprisal, Alexander sent assassins back to the rear to murder Parmenion, Philotas' father and the army's most senior general. Parmenion had been the man who designed the very strategies that won Alexander's greatest battles. To the army, his murder was an act of cold, preemptive terror. By executing his most capable commanders on mere suspicion, Alexander signaled that no amount of past service could protect his inner circle from his fear. As the army pushed into the jagged mountains of Central Asia, the atmosphere in the camp became increasingly toxic. In Samarkand, years of tension finally broke. During a drunken argument, Alexander was challenged by Cleitus the Black, one of his oldest friends. In a rage, Alexander took a spear and killed the man who had saved his life during his first battle against the Persians. Following the murder, Alexander's demands grew even more extreme. He insisted that his Greek officers perform proskynesis, requiring them to prostrate themselves on the ground in his presence. This was a line his men could not cross. To the Greeks, such a gesture was reserved only for the gods, and demanding it was an act of pure blasphemy. By placing himself above the divine, Alexander had removed the last common ground he shared with his men. No longer their fellow soldier, he was a stranger they were forced to worship. After 8 years of marching across thousands of miles, the army reached the edge of the Indus Valley. They were physically and mentally spent. At the River Hyphasis, the invincible Macedonian machine finally stopped. For the first time, the soldiers defied their king, refusing to march any further into India. Furious at their defiance, Alexander turned back, but he led them through a brutal desert landscape, causing more deaths than any battle he'd fought. The final collapse occurred after his closest friend, Hephaestion, died of a fever. Alexander fell into a state of inconsolable grief and erratic behavior, lashing out at both his governors and his men. His drive for total control had not only alienated his commanders, it had successfully broken the spirit of the finest army in history. By 323 BC, Alexander was back in Babylon, planning yet another campaign. But at 32, he was suddenly struck down by a severe, mysterious fever. History has never settled the cause of his death. It may have been a natural illness, or it may have been the ultimate response of an inner circle who had come to fear their king more than their enemies. He died without ever naming an heir. Within years, his family had been murdered, and his generals were tearing the empire apart to build their own smaller kingdoms. Alexander had conquered the known world, but in his fear of losing it, he had systematically dismantled the very trust that held his power together.